Hello and welcome to Mr. C History. Now today I am in Whitechapel, and in the autumn of 1888 this was the location of 5 brutal and gruesome murders that sent shockwaves and a frenzy throughout London. These of course are the murders of Jack the Ripper. Now I'm actually going to make 2 videos about this, one about the murders and the police investigation, etc. But I'm also going to make a video about the victims, the 5 women who Jack the Ripper murdered, because those women are often forgotten and, dare I say, dismissed. So please make sure you subscribe to see that next week. But first of all, let's look at what Whitechapel was like in 1888. Now, Whitechapel has seen a lot of change over the time, but there are still places like this, Parford Street, where pockets still exist that look very Victorian in nature. And this is a good place to discuss what Whitechapel was like in 1888. Well, it was a place of great poverty and deprivation. About 80,000 people lived in Whitechapel, a very small area. It was a place of disease and filth as well. Infant mortality was awful. 50% of children would not reach their 5th birthday. Unbelievable. That meant it was a place which was a hotbed of crime, and the police knew this about this area. There were gangs, there was petty theft. It was a depressing place of Victorian London. It was not a good place to be a woman. Many of Jack the Ripper's victims, they had no fixed address. They had to just scrounge around in the day to find whatever money they could so they could afford the few pence it would take to sleep in one of the doss houses like this. So they would have to go beg, do some sort of menial work, or unfortunately sell their bodies for sex. Whitechapel was also associated with immigration. Many people had come from all over Europe here to London, especially from Eastern Europe, many of whom were also Jewish. All of this is a good backdrop for a psychopathic serial killer to prey upon his victims. And at the end of the summer of 1888, Jack the Ripper strikes for the first time. One other thing to add is that actually by the autumn of 1888 there had already been a couple of murders here in Whitechapel, murders of women. In the Easter time, Emma Smith had been attacked actually by a gang of men. She survived briefly and she was able to tell the police the details of her killers when she died eventually a couple of days later of her injuries. So that was a gangland murder. And then in the early summer, Martha Tabram had been stabbed 39 times, a real frenzied attack, and that had caused some shockwaves. Now, these 2 are not considered the Jack the Ripper murders, the canonical 5, the 5 victims that Jack the Ripper murdered. I think Martha, she was stabbed, and Jack the Ripper preferred to slash, and he also mutilated more. She wasn't ultimately mutilated, but it still stands to the point that by the autumn of 1888, Whitechapel is a bit on edge. There has been murders around, crime is rising, there is a fear bubbling. At 3:45 a.m. on the 31st of August 1888, a brutal discovery was found here, pretty much exactly at the spot, the door here to Whitechapel Station, on what is now known as Durwood Street, but in 1888 it was known as Bucks Row. A body was discovered. A brutally disfigured and horrendously attacked body of a woman by the name of Mary Ann Nichols, or as she was known, Polly Nichols. Her throat had been horribly slashed, so much so with a jagged knife that it got down all the way to the vertebrae, and her abdomen had been cut open again with this jaggedy large knife, and her bowels were protruding out of it. It was a horrible sight to see. What is clear is that this was a deliberate attack, a deliberate murder. It wasn't just some ordinary scuffle or a fight in the street. This was a person who was targeted and was brutally attacked. Now, initially, the police just, again, thought this was a gangland murder, maybe just a one-off, didn't really think too much of it, just another thing that happens in Whitechapel. But the press, by this point, has started to pick up. The brutality of the murder and the rumblings over the summer meant that the Star newspaper suggested that, is this the work of a serial killer? Indeed, they used the phrase, is there a monster among us? Raising the temperature of the frenzy even higher. Now, there's been so much building work over here because of the Elizabeth line, but amazingly there's a survivor. This building here, which I think must be flats now, but originally was a sort of workhouse, one of those doss houses we talked about, and that's would have definitely been there in 1888, and so Polly Nichols would have walked right past that, and possibly so would the killer. On the 8th of September, just over a week later, the killer strikes again here at 29 Hanbury Street, just off Brick Lane. In the backyard of a house that was just here, a horrible discovery was made. The body of Annie Chapman, and once again she'd been brutally mutilated. Her throat savagely cut deep, her face also stabbed and attacked. Had also been disemboweled, cut open, her intestines flung over her shoulders, and worse yet, her uterus had been removed and taken away. A horrible discovery, and it was a worse mutilation than Polly Nichols, mainly because it was a bit more in private. Polly was murdered on the streets. This was in a backyard. It looks very different to now. It's a rather nice shop, but this would have just been a row of houses which you would have to go through to get into the garden. So possibly the killer had been invited in and the murder took place in the garden. It, of course, causes a panic. Now, the police don't really know what to do. They take a lot of witness statements, but as always, the press really get hold of this, and it kind of goes out of control. One witness statement suggests they saw Annie Chapman talking to a person of foreign descent, so that causes a huge amount of xenophobia. And then there's this issue of the leather apron. I can't quite find out whether this was actually a true statement by a witness or it was just made up by the press, but the press wanted to point the finger at somebody, and they suggested that they were looking for somebody with a leather apron, and so the finger is pointed at some poor Polish Jewish bootmaker called Joseph Pizer, who wore a leather apron. He had an alibi and it was all fine, but probably the damage was done for that poor bloke after that. But it highlights the fear, the panic, and the need for people to be blamed, to find the killer. Whitechapel is on edge. But it goes wider. The Home Secretary gets involved, the speeches in Parliament, the local MP even sets up a reward to find the killer. This is taking on a life of its own. This is Leman Street Station, and remarkably at 1888 this was also still a police station. It's changed a bit since. I think the Luftwaffe had something to do with that. But this is where H Division was based, the police force that was investigating the Jack the Ripper case. Now, the police are not going to cover themselves in glory in this story, and they were quite inept. But maybe that's a little bit harsh for me to say, because they had quite a few things working against them. One of them was jurisdiction. Now, I mentioned H Division, they were patrolling this area of Whitechapel, but one of the murders, Catherine Eddowes, the fourth murder, actually took place in the City of London, and the City of London police went to investigate that, and that caused issues with communication and even the handling of evidence. As the murders progress and the frenzy grows, the investigation actually gets taken over by Sir Charles Warren, who's based over in Scotland Yard. He knows nothing about the Whitechapel area or anything like that. The police also don't have many tools at their disposal. No fingerprinting, no CCTV, no DNA, anything like that. It's all done by sort of notebook, so that's not going very well. They did have sniffer dogs, which they tried to employ, but not much to go on. They're also operating in a difficult area, an area where there is a mistrust for the police, either because people are the criminals themselves, or they've got questionable immigration status, and the police are getting fed lots of fake witness statements and information like that. There's also quite a lot of suspects. Unfortunately, Whitechapel had a lot of criminals, a lot of people who were deemed lunatics at the time, so there were lots of suspects to go on, lots of people for the press to point the finger at. And that's another thing, there was a lot of pressure on the police, especially from the press, but even from people like Queen Victoria. She wrote a letter to Charles Warren demanding answers. So they're under a lot of pressure, very little in technology or skills to deal with, and they've got a lot of information, some of which is not true, to deal with. So no wonder the police couldn't really do anything. Now, with London on edge, a significant thing happens on the 30th of September. The killer strikes again, not once, but twice within an hour, in what is known as the double event. The first murder takes place right here. This is what is now called Henrique Street, but in 1888 it was known as Burner Street, and this was the entrance to Dutfield's Yard, which was actually a stable for a working man's club, and it was quite literally at this gateway here where a body was discovered, that of Elizabeth Stride. She was discovered with that signature really deep cut throat in a pool of her own blood. But that was it. No mutilations, nothing else. It would seem the killer was somehow disturbed. It was 1 a.m, but I think this stable was quite busy, so horses bolting or people bringing in their carts, etc. Now, the police actually thought they were onto a bit of a winner here with Elizabeth Stride because there was a key witness who saw her being attacked. The witness was a man called Israel Schwartz, who was an Hungarian Jewish man, and he saw Elizabeth fighting and tussling with a man in the streets who shouted Lipski, which is either an anti-Semitic slur or reference to Israel Lipski, who had been hanged for a murder the previous year. But unfortunately for the police, Israel Schwartz did not testify. Various reasons here, but I think one of them is that key thing I was talking about, this slight fear of the police or this xenophobia surge going through the press. I think Israel Schwartz might have feared, he wanted to stay below the parapet, he didn't want to go out and be this name in the press, I would suggest. So another frustrating setback for the police. So why is this considered one of the canonical five, one of Jack the Ripper's murders? Well, that's because just 45 minutes later he strikes again. Now, this is known as the double event because just 45 minutes later the killer was here at Mitre Square in the City of London, and he found his next victim. This was Catherine Eddowes, who had actually only about an hour before had been in the police station arrested for drunkenness and had stumbled back, and Jack the Ripper had preyed upon her. Her body was found just along the wall there. It was very, very different. There were houses just right there, and she was brutally murdered like others. It would have been in total silence as well, because those houses would have seen or heard something. But signature, some throat slashed. She had had her ear and her nose cut off and disemboweled again, intestines on the shoulder like old Annie Chapman. And also this time she had had a kidney removed. Some sort of trophy for the killer. As you can imagine, this causes a frenzy. 2 murders in one night. None of the women of Whitechapel are safe. The press have a field day. And once again, the police are nowhere, although they discover a clue. This is Goulston Street, about half a mile from Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. Now, nowadays it's a very vibrant food market, but in 1888 this was one of those doss houses, a very deprived, poor area. And after the murder of Catherine Eddowes in an alleyway where there is now a fish and chip shop, they found an apron, a bloodied apron that many witnesses claimed belonged to Catherine Eddowes. A tantalising clue there for the police, but that wasn't the only thing. The apron was on the floor. Next to it was some graffiti, a graffito that said, "The Jews are the men who will not be blamed for nothing." The Jews was spelled J-U-W-S, but what does that mean? That's a very, very cryptic message, and it didn't actually hang around for long. Charles Warren, the policeman from Scotland Yard, he had it quickly removed, washed away, because he was very fearful of an anti-Semitic riot taking place in East London. Tensions were so high now, and there was so much xenophobia, it was going to come about. What does that message mean? Could it be that Jack the Ripper is trying to frame the Jews, or was he a Jewish person himself? Who knows? It's so difficult to quite understand and interpret. Over the next few weeks, the police got lots and lots of more clues, many of them coming in the form of letters. They received hundreds of letters, all from people around Whitechapel, most of them complete hoaxes and crazy. But there were some really interesting, significant ones. One's called the Dear John letter. The reason why that's significant, that was the first use of the words Jack the Ripper. They signed off Jack the Ripper, which the press is going to love. And then there is the infamous From Hell letter, received on the 15th of October 1888. It was a letter that claimed to be from the killer, and it described how he was from hell, he was a demon. It also, gruesomely, the letter came with a package inside of which was half a kidney. And when tests were made, it was found it was half of a human kidney. They didn't have the DNA to find out if it was Catherine Eddowes, who indeed had a kidney missing. These letters sent the press into a frenzy. Indeed, it created this myth around this person who now has a name, Jack the Ripper, this sort of myth that he's almost a supernatural being, a demon. And it would have caused mayhem on the streets that they were looking for this person who isn't even a human. And I think that explains actually modern day obsession with Jack the Ripper, this almost supernatural fear that we have of this person. Another interesting thing about Goulston Street is that a few years ago, a criminologist did what is known as geographic profiling. This is where they take all the murders of a serial killer and anything else they know about the serial killer, plot it all on a map, and then try and geolocate where that killer would have lived. And the strong possibility is that he lived here on Goulston Street, round about where those tenement areas are. Now, the double event took place on the 30th of September, and throughout October there were no murders, just speculation. But on the 9th of November 1888, a horrible, horrible discovery was made. Now, things look very different now, but in 1888, this was Dorset Street, one of the most notorious and infamous streets in Whitechapel, with an unbelievable level of deprivation. But it was here at 13 Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street, where Mary Jane Kelly lived, and on the 9th of November her mutilated corpse was found. Now, this is slightly different from the other murders. This one took place indoors, and clearly Jack the Ripper had had more time with this victim. Some police say maybe 2 hours he had had, which meant that he mutilated her beyond belief. It is a truly gruesome thing, which we don't need to go into all of it, but the same thing, the horrendously slit throat, the disembowelment, but her organs had also been taken out and put all around the room. Her heart had been taken away, and maybe another trophy for him. It was a horrible, horrible sight. What was also interesting is that her clothes were folded in the corner of the room. Now, you can read into this various different things, but one thing that was taken from this was that she had obviously brought him in to her dwelling as a client, which led the police to recognise that actually this person presented him as a normal person, somebody you might trust and be able to interact with. Once he lured you in, attacked in a frenzy and a rage. But whatever the case, the fear is now at its highest point. But what's interesting, at this highest point, suddenly the murders stop. This is the end of the canonical 5 murders of Jack the Ripper. Interesting, there are a couple more murders in the next coming years in Whitechapel. None of them quite match the modus operandi of Jack the Ripper. So what happened? There are a lot of theories as to why the murders suddenly stop. Was he arrested for something else? Was he institutionalized in some mental asylum? Did he become a victim of a crime and even die himself? We just don't know. But even though the murders stop, there is still speculation as to who it was. Now, what about these theories as to who Jack the Ripper was? Well, there was obviously a lot of speculation at the time. Initially, they were looking for this sort of doctor-like figure, but actually the incisions were quite crude, and it probably wasn't done by somebody with that much of an anatomical knowledge. And there were lots of fanciful accusations put around, many of them not actually based on any evidence, and purely conspiracy theories. Things like Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of Clarence, who I think was a bit of a public hate figure. Dr. Gould, who was Queen Victoria's personal physician. None of this actually stood up any water. There are only 2 interesting ones. One was George Chapman, who a few years later was convicted of murdering 3 women. And he was known in the Whitechapel area as a bit aggressive, and he was a barber, so probably he would have access to all the knives and stuff. But he was arrested for murder a few years later for poisoning, and he wasn't really violent with a knife or anything like that. And I think he might have had an alibi for 1 or 2 of the murders. But the most interesting one is a man called Aaron Kosminski. Now, he was known to the police as a petty criminal, and a few years later he was institutionalized in a lunatic asylum and lived there for many, many years. So clearly not a man with a full grip of all his faculties. 2 other recent things have come about. One was a scarf, a shawl that belonged to Catherine Eddowes. It was in safekeeping Metropolitan Police evidence files, obviously for hundreds of years. And in 2014, they did some DNA analysis on it, and on it they found traces of DNA that matched Aaron Kosminski's descendants. His DNA was on Catherine Eddowes' scarf. Or was it? There's a lot of debate about the provenance of that scarf. Suddenly it materialised in the Metropolitan Police files. No record of it being any other time, which is a bit dodgy. But another interesting thing about Aaron Kosminski is where he lived. Where did he live? You guessed it, he lived in Goulston Street, which that criminologist said is probably the location as to where the killer was. The truth is, we don't know. And we probably will never know. And this is part of the reason why this is so fascinating. This true crime obsession we have nowadays, we need to know the answer. But unfortunately, we probably never will. So there you are, the tale of Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders. Some interesting themes come about that, ones I didn't perhaps know about before I researched more into this. One was the anti-Semitic connection. I didn't quite realise the impact the Jewish community had here. And as the frenzy grew, the press wanted to point the finger at someone, and the age-old stereotypes of blaming the immigrant came through again. What's also interesting, which has helped to explain why the legacy of Jack the Ripper lives on still so much today, and why there's all sorts of tourism and things connected with him. He's got this sort of mythological, it's almost supernatural kind of reputation now, which I think is wrong. This was a cruel, brutal, horrible psychopath who clearly hated women, and he is somebody who should not be adulated or commemorated in any way, and he is not the one who should be remembered. It should be the 5 victims, the 5 women who he killed, which is why next week I shall be doing a whole video on the canonical 5, the 5 women that Jack the Ripper killed, because it is their stories that deserve to be heard and told. So make sure you subscribe for that. But anyway, as always, I hope you've enjoyed that. Please let me know what you think, and I'll see you on the next one.